Evelyn Harper was a woman who had lived her life quietly and without much fuss, the kind of person who faded into the background of her small Pennsylvania town. She was 60 years old, a widow for over a decade, and while she maintained an appearance of contentment, the reality was much bleaker. Evelyn's life had become a monotonous routine since the death of her husband, Robert. She had married young, at the age of 22, to a man she barely knew. Robert had been a good provider and a decent father, but their marriage had never been passionate. It had been practical, convenient, and mostly distant. When Robert passed away from a heart attack at 52, Evelyn felt grief, but it was mixed with a strange sense of relief. Freedom she hadn't anticipated. After his death, Evelyn had tried to fill the void with small pleasures. She joined a book club, started gardening again, and became more involved in her church. But the companionship she longed for, the spark of excitement or even affection, remained elusive. Her children, both grown and busy with their own lives, called occasionally and visited on holidays. But it wasn't enough to fill the deep well of loneliness inside her. Her grandson, Kyle, had been her one source of consistent joy. Kyle, now 22, had always been close to his grandmother. After his parents divorced when he was a teenager, Evelyn had been a steady figure in his life, someone he could rely on when things got tough. Kyle lived in a small apartment in town, working part-time while trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He had dropped out of college after a few semesters, unsure of what career path to follow, and had been drifting ever since. Kyle often came over to Evelyn's house for dinner, or just to talk. He would bring his best friend, Luke, a tall, scruffy guy with an easy smile and a rebellious streak. Luke had grown up on the wrong side of town and had a reputation for trouble, small-time theft, reckless behavior, and a string of dead-end jobs. But despite his rough edges, Kyle trusted Luke, and over time, Luke became a regular at Evelyn's house too. At first, Evelyn thought of Luke as just another one of Kyle's friends, someone to feed and occasionally scold for not taking life seriously enough. But over the months, Luke began spending more time at her house, even when Kyle wasn't around. He would stop by to help with small chores or fix things around the house. Nothing too serious, but enough to make Evelyn feel like she had a companion again. Luke would stay for tea, sitting on the porch and listening to Evelyn talk about her garden or her memories of the town when it was smaller, quieter. For Luke, who had grown up with little structure or stability, Evelyn's home was a peaceful refuge. He had bounced between different jobs and apartments, never staying in one place for long. His own family was broken. His mother had left when he was young, and his father, a bitter alcoholic, had never been much of a presence. Luke found solace in Evelyn's quiet life, her soft voice, and the warmth of her home. She was different from the women he usually spent time with, more patient, more forgiving. Evelyn, for her part, started to enjoy Luke's company in ways she hadn't expected. There was something intoxicating about the attention he gave her. He noticed things about her that no one else did, complimented her hair when she let it down, laughed at her jokes, and always seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. Luke was young, attractive in a rough-edged way, and Evelyn hadn't felt this kind of attention in years, if ever. It started innocently enough. Luke would linger a little too long after fixing a broken faucet, or their hands would brush while passing a cup of tea. Evelyn told herself it was nothing, just her imagination, a foolish indulgence of an old woman who was starved for affection. But the electricity was undeniable, and as much as she tried to ignore it, she couldn't help but look forward to his visits. The real shift happened one evening when Kyle had to leave town for a few days. Evelyn invited Luke over for dinner, as she often did, and the atmosphere felt different from the start. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken but thick between them. They talked, laughed, and drank more wine than usual. Luke leaned in closer, and suddenly, the boundaries of their relationship blurred. That night, something broke open between them. Luke kissed her, A slow, deliberate kiss that caught Evelyn completely off guard, but pulled her in at the same time. She hadn't been kissed like that in decades, and in that moment, all of her loneliness, her yearning, came flooding to the surface. She kissed him back, letting herself indulge in a fantasy she knew was wrong, but felt impossible to resist. What followed was an affair that surprised them both. For Luke, it was less about lust and more about the comfort Evelyn provided, a softness, a warmth he had never experienced in his chaotic life. For Evelyn, it was a dangerous thrill, a chance to feel alive again after years of emotional numbness. They met in secret, always careful, always under the cover of night or when Kyle was away. But guilt gnawed at Evelyn. She knew how wrong it was, how much she was betraying her grandson, the boy she had practically raised. Every time Luke left her house in the early hours of the morning, she promised herself it would be the last time. And yet, the loneliness always came creeping back, and when Luke knocked on her door, she always let him in. As the weeks went by, the affair deepened, and so did the risks they were taking. They became more reckless, meeting when Kyle was only a room away. Hiding in plain sight, Luke would steal glances at Evelyn when Kyle wasn't looking, and Evelyn's heart would race every time their eyes met. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially ones as twisted and fragile as theirs. Kyle started noticing things. How his grandmother seemed more nervous when Luke was around, how Luke's casual visits had become more frequent, even when Kyle wasn't home. At first, he shrugged it off, but the nagging feeling that something was off kept gnawing at him. One evening, Kyle came home earlier than expected after a night out with friends. The house was quiet, but he heard hushed voices from the living room. He walked in on Evelyn and Luke sitting too close, the air between them thick with something he couldn't quite place but made his stomach turn. The way Luke quickly pulled away and how Evelyn's face flushed with panic set off alarms in Kyle's mind. He didn't confront them right then, choosing instead to watch, to wait, to figure out what was really going on. From that moment on, Kyle became more suspicious. He watched how they interacted, noticing little things he had ignored before. How Luke always seemed to show up when he wasn't around, how his grandmother avoided eye contact when Luke was mentioned. The more Kyle watched, the more he began to piece together the horrifying truth. Meanwhile, Evelyn tried to push the affair out of her mind, telling herself it was just a phase, a fleeting distraction. But her guilt was ever present, haunting her even in her sleep. She knew it was only a matter of time before Kyle found out, and the thought terrified her. She had raised him, loved him like a son, and now she was betraying him in the worst possible way. As for Luke, he began to feel the walls closing in. He was used to living on the edge, taking risks, but this was different. The stakes were higher, and the consequences far more severe. He cared for Evelyn in a strange, complicated way, but he also knew how wrong it was. Still, he couldn't stop himself. The secrecy, the danger, only made the affair more intoxicating. As the weeks dragged on, the tension between them all became unbearable. Kyle's suspicions grew, Luke and Evelyn's guilt deepened, and the fragile balance they had maintained was on the verge of collapsing. None of them knew it yet, but they were all heading toward a breaking point, one that would shatter their lives forever. As the weeks passed, the affair between Evelyn and Luke deepened, becoming more reckless and difficult to hide. Each secret meeting left Evelyn with a profound sense of guilt, but that guilt seemed to dissipate the moment Luke was near. She knew that their relationship was built on deceit, and that if Kyle ever found out, the consequences would be devastating. But as much as she tried to resist, she couldn't pull herself away from Luke. Every touch, every stolen moment, only seemed to entangle them further in the dangerous game they were playing. Luke, too, found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. What had started as a flirtation, a curiosity, had turned into something far more complicated. He wasn't sure if it was love, but it was something powerful, something he couldn't shake. Being with Evelyn gave him a sense of stability and warmth he had never known growing up. He craved that feeling, even though he knew it was wrong. And yet, every time he left her house he felt a gnawing sense of dread, as if their secret was hanging by a thread, ready to unravel at any moment. Kyle, on the other hand, was starting to put the pieces together. The strange glances between his grandmother and Luke, the way she always seemed more flustered when Luke was around, and the fact that Luke was spending more time at her house, even when Kyle wasn't there. It all added up. He didn't want to believe it, but the signs were too hard to ignore. Kyle began to watch them more closely, trying to catch them in the act, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. He just knew something wasn't right. One evening, Kyle's suspicions nearly came to a head. It was late, and he had gone out with friends, leaving Luke and Evelyn alone at her house. They had planned it that way, knowing Kyle wouldn't be back for hours. Luke arrived just after sunset, slipping through the back door like a shadow. Evelyn had prepared a simple dinner, but neither of them was particularly hungry. Instead, they sat on the couch, close enough that their knees touched, their conversation quiet, the air between them thick with tension. As they talked, Evelyn felt the weight of their secret pressing down on her. She was living in a constant state of fear, terrified that Kyle would find out. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him. He was her grandson, her closest family. But Luke had become an addiction, a need she couldn't ignore. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that it was just a phase, that it would end soon. But deep down, she knew that she had lost control. Luke, for his part, was growing more reckless. He liked the danger, the thrill of sneaking around, the way Evelyn clung to him as if he were the only thing keeping her alive. But he also knew that they were running out of time. Kyle was getting suspicious, and it was only a matter of time before he confronted them. They couldn't keep this up forever. As they sat in silence, the sound of the front door suddenly creaked open. Kyle's voice echoed through the house, calling for his grandmother. Panic shot through Evelyn like ice. Luke jumped up from the couch, his eyes wide with fear. They hadn't expected Kyle to be back so soon. Evelyn quickly stood, trying to calm her racing heart. "Stay calm," she whispered to Luke. "We just have to act normal." But nothing about this situation was normal. Luke hid in the kitchen while Evelyn hurried to greet Kyle, hoping her face didn't betray her guilt. Kyle stood in the hallway, his eyes narrowing as he saw the tension in his grandmother's posture. "What's going on?" Kyle asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Nothing," Evelyn lied, forcing a smile. "I was just cleaning up. What are you doing home so early?" Kyle shrugged, though his eyes continued to scan the room. "Plans changed. Where's Luke?" "His car's out front." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had forgotten that Luke's car was parked in the driveway. The glaring mistake. "Oh, he was helping me with something in the garden. I think he's out back," she stammered. Kyle didn't seem convinced. He moved toward the kitchen, his eyes narrowing as if he could sense the tension in the air. Evelyn felt her stomach twist into knots. Luke was hiding just around the corner, and she knew that if Kyle saw him now, everything would come crashing down. Before Kyle could take another step, Luke appeared from the back door, wiping his hands on a towel as if he had just been working outside. "Hey, man," Luke said casually, his voice a little too relaxed. "Was just fixing up your grandma's garden for her." Kyle stared at him, his eyes flickering between Luke and Evelyn. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, but Kyle didn't say anything. Instead, he nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "Right," he muttered. "I'm going to bed. See you tomorrow." As soon as Kyle disappeared up the stairs, Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her knees trembling with relief. That had been too close, far too close. Luke walked over to her, pulling her into a quick embrace, but Evelyn pushed him away. "This has to stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We can't keep doing this." It's going to destroy everything. Luke frowned, his expression hardening. You don't mean that. I do, Evelyn insisted, though part of her heart was still aching for him. Kyle's getting suspicious. He knows something is wrong. Let him, Luke muttered, his voice filled with defiance. We can handle it. Evelyn shook her head, tears prickling her eyes. No, we can't. This isn't just about us. I can't lose my grandson over this. Luke didn't say anything. He knew she was right, but he also knew that neither of them had the strength to stop. The attraction between them had grown into something dark and all-consuming, and no matter how much they tried to resist, they always found their way back to each other. After that night, the tension between Kyle, Luke, and Evelyn grew unbearable. Kyle became more suspicious, more paranoid, watching their every move. He noticed how Luke always seemed to be around when he wasn't there, how his grandmother's mood shifted whenever Luke's name was mentioned. The lies piled up, and with each one, Kyle's anger simmered closer to the surface. One afternoon, while Kyle was at work, Evelyn and Luke met in secret again. This time, there was no pretense, no excuses. They both knew what they were doing, and the guilt that usually followed was nowhere to be found. They kissed in the dim light of the living room, hands tangled in each other's clothes, lost in the moment. But as they pulled apart, something shifted in Evelyn's expression. I can't do this anymore, she whispered, her voice breaking. We've gone too far. Luke's jaw tightened. What are you saying? Evelyn stepped back, tears streaming down her face. I'm saying that it's over. We have to stop before it destroys everything. Luke stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Evelyn, before he could finish, the sound of the front door opening stopped him in his tracks. Kyle's voice echoed through the hallway, calling for his grandmother again. Panic flashed in Evelyn's eyes as she pushed Luke away, frantically straightening her clothes. Luke quickly retreated to the kitchen. But this time, Kyle wasn't buying any of their excuses. Kyle walked into the living room, his face hard and unreadable. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Evelyn froze, her mind racing for an explanation. Nothing, Kyle. Luke was just helping me with something in the kitchen. Kyle's eyes flicked toward the kitchen, where Luke was standing, his face pale. Helping you with something? Kyle repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that what you call it? Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the walls closing in around her. Kyle, please, don't lie to me, Kyle snapped, his eyes blazing with anger. I've seen how you look at him. I know something's going on between you two. Evelyn felt her stomach twist into knots. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. Kyle, it's not what you think. Then what the hell is it? Kyle demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like you're sleeping with my best friend. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. There was nothing she could say to make this right. Kyle's hands balled into fists at his sides, his whole body trembling with fury. You're sick, he spat, his voice filled with disgust. Both of you. With that, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Evelyn collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. She had known this would happen. She had known all along that their secret would come out. But knowing didn't make it any easier. The atmosphere in Evelyn Harper's house had become increasingly strained and toxic. With Kyle's discovery of the affair between his grandmother and his best friend, the once ordinary home had turned into a battleground of secrets and raw emotions. Kyle's silence was deafening, his anger and betrayal palpable in every glance, every avoided conversation. Evelyn felt trapped in her own house, the walls closing in around her, her once safe haven now a prison of guilt and dread. Luke continued to visit, though their encounters had become fraught with tension. They met in the dark, when the house was empty, trying to salvage what they could from the mess they had made. But the once thrilling secrecy of their affair had turned into a burden too heavy to bear. The stolen moments, the whispered conversations, were now laced with fear and paranoia. One evening, Evelyn sat alone in her living room, the silence almost deafening. She stared blankly at the television, not really seeing it, her mind consumed with thoughts of how she had come to this point. The truth of her situation loomed over her like a storm cloud. She had betrayed the one person who had been her greatest source of joy, and now the consequences were crashing down upon her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden, jarring sound of the doorbell. Evelyn's heart raced as she glanced at the clock. Kyle wasn't supposed to be home for hours. She hesitated for a moment, then rose and opened the door. To her surprise, it was Kyle, standing on the doorstep, his face set in a grim expression. He was holding a small box in his hands. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, her heart sinking at the sight of him. "Kyle, what are you doing here?" Kyle pushed past her into the house, his demeanor cold and unyielding. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to sort this out." Evelyn nodded, her anxiety mounting. "Come in, let's sit down." They moved to the living room, where Kyle set the box on the coffee table and took a seat across from Evelyn. She sat down opposite him, her hands trembling slightly. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken pain and anger. Finally, Kyle broke the silence. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice breaking. "I never thought you'd be capable of this. Not just with anyone, but with Luke, my best friend." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Kyle, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. It was a mistake." "Mistake?" Kyle interrupted, his eyes blazing. "This isn't just some mistake. It's a betrayal. Everything we had, our family, our trust, it's all been destroyed." Evelyn's voice cracked with emotion. I know it's unforgivable, but I'm asking you to try to understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never meant for any of this to come out." Kyle's face hardened. "Understanding. You expect me to just forgive and forget. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Evelyn's heart ached as she looked at her grandson, the weight of her actions crashing down upon her. "Please, Kyle. I'm begging you. Don't shut me out. I'm trying to make things right." Before Kyle could respond, the sound of the doorbell rang again, cutting through the tension. Both of them froze, looking at each other in confusion. Evelyn's heart raced. "I didn't expect anyone," she said, standing up and walking toward the door. As she opened it, Luke stood on the other side, looking uncomfortable and nervous. "I need to talk to both of you," he said, his eyes darting between Evelyn and Kyle. "Can I come in?" Kyle's face flushed with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "You have no right to be here." Luke held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I know I don't have a right, but I need to explain. I need to make this right." Evelyn looked between Kyle and Luke, feeling as though the world was closing in around her. She stepped aside to let Luke in, her heart heavy with dread. The three of them sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. Kyle's anger was palpable, while Luke's guilt was almost suffocating. Evelyn could feel the weight of their expectations and the gravity of her situation pressing down on her. "I want to explain," Luke began, his voice shaking. "What happened between us? It wasn't just physical. I cared about Evelyn. I cared about her in a way I didn't expect. I'm sorry for what I've done. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I wanted you to know that I'm truly sorry." Kyle's face turned a shade of red, his fists clenched at his sides. "Sorry. That's all you have to say. Your apologies won't fix what you've broken." Luke's shoulders slumped. "I know. I can't undo the damage I've done. I just wanted you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. I'm as much a victim of this situation as anyone." Evelyn could see that the situation was spiraling out of control. Her heart pounded as she tried to find the right words. "Kyle, please try to understand. We're all hurting. We're all trying to make sense of this. I know it's hard to forgive, but we need to find a way to move forward." But Kyle was beyond reasoning. His eyes were filled with rage and hurt, and he stood up abruptly. "I can't do this," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't be here. I need to get out." Before anyone could react, Kyle grabbed the box from the coffee table and stormed out of the house. Evelyn and Luke exchanged panicked glances, their minds racing as they tried to process the sudden turn of events. The next few hours were a blur. Evelyn tried to reach Kyle, but he didn't answer his phone. Her worry grew with each passing minute. She knew that their confrontation had pushed him to the edge, and she feared what he might do. As night fell, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. Evelyn and Luke sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of their actions pressing heavily on them. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine roared outside. Evelyn looked out the window and saw Kyle's car parked across the street. Her heart sank. What was he doing? Without thinking, Evelyn rushed outside, followed closely by Luke. They approached the car, where Kyle was sitting behind the wheel, his face pale and strained. "Kyle," Evelyn called out, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, come inside. We need to talk." Kyle looked at them with a mixture of anger and despair. "There's nothing left to say," he said, his voice cold. "I've had enough." Before Evelyn could respond, Kyle started the car and backed out of the driveway, speeding away into the night. Evelyn and Luke watched in helpless silence as he disappeared from view. The hours that followed were a blur of panic and fear. Evelyn's mind raced with thoughts of her grandson, his safety, and the devastating consequences of their actions. She knew that things had reached a breaking point, and she feared the worst. The next morning brought no relief. Evelyn and Luke were on edge, their minds consumed with worry and guilt. The police arrived at the house, responding to a call about a possible disturbance. Evelyn was shaken as she explained the situation, her voice trembling as she recounted the events of the previous night. The police took a report and promised to keep an eye out for Kyle. As they left, Evelyn felt a heavy sense of dread settle over her. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she felt powerless to stop it. Later that day, the worst news came. Kyle's car had been found abandoned on the side of the road, and there were signs of a struggle. The police launched a search, but there was no sign of Kyle. The weight of their actions, the guilt and fear, was unbearable. Days passed, and the search for Kyle continued. The media picked up the story, turning it into a sensation. Evelyn and Luke were subjected to a barrage of questions and accusations. Their lives turned into a public spectacle. Eventually, Kyle's body was found. The details were grim. He had been killed in a violent altercation, his death a tragic consequence of the tangled web of secrets and lies that had consumed their lives. Evelyn was devastated. The loss of her grandson was a blow she couldn't recover from, and the guilt of knowing that her actions had led to his death was overwhelming. Luke, too, was shattered by the events. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and the trial revealed the full extent of their affair and the circumstances leading up to Kyle's death. The court proceedings were a media frenzy, with Evelyn and Luke's sordid affair becoming the center of attention. Luke was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his role in Kyle's death, while Evelyn received a lighter sentence for her part in covering up the crime. As they faced their sentences, Evelyn and Luke were left to grapple with the consequences of their actions. Their once simple lives had been shattered, their family destroyed, and the price of their dangerous game was paid in full. Evelyn's life after the trial was a shell of what it had once been. The weight of her guilt and the loss of her grandson were constant reminders of the choices she had made. She lived out her days in isolation, haunted by the memories of what she had lost and the cost of her betrayal. Luke's time in prison was marked by regret and reflection. He had lost everything: his freedom, his future, and the woman he had once loved. His days were spent in contemplation, trying to come to terms with the tragedy that had unfolded and the role he had played in it. In the end, the affair between Evelyn and Luke had led to a devastating climax, a tragic reminder of the consequences of deceit and betrayal. Their lives, once filled with potential and promise, had been consumed by the darkness of their choices, leaving a legacy of pain and sorrow that would echo through the years to come.